One of the ways to grow your wealth and become financially free is to have multiple streams of income, also known as side hustles or passive income. In my previous video, I shared with you my 7 streams of income and how I make thousands of pounds from those. In today's video, I want to share with you my favorite of all of those side hustles, and that obviously is real estate, specifically Airbnb. And I love doing Airbnb because it gives me the freedom that I desire, the control that I want, and the money that I need. All of these at a very little cost. Unlike other side hustles that may require you to have, some capital or has a steep learning curve or even require some accreditation or licenses, with Airbnb, you don't need any of these really. And so if you stay with me till the end of this video, I'll show you how you can make money from Airbnb starting today by making a first listing, even if you don't own your own place. Stay with me. Having been a host, in fact, a super host on Airbnb for the last 2 years, I feel I'm in the right position to share at this point, the experiences that I've gleaned over the time, the learning that I've gathered, and so that you can also make your first listing today without making the mistakes that I made. And I want to show you how easy it is really to start Airbnb. But first, let me tell you why I got into Airbnb. You'll be surprised to know that the reason why I started Airbnb was actually not because of the money. You see, back in the day, I used to travel quite a bit. And whenever I traveled, I preferred to stay in Airbnbs as compared to hotels because unlike Airbnbs, when you're in a hotel, you are all by yourself. There's nobody to speak to, nobody to ask questions about the local area. At best, you speak to the receptionist who could be, overly formal. So it could take something away from the experience. But in Airbnbs, you had all of these, especially in Airbnbs where the host also lives in the property. And it's actually been great, whether I was in Dar es Salaam or Dundee or somewhere, elsewhere. It's been fantastic. Until actually one time when I stayed in a location I prefer not to name. Not because, the flat wasn't nice or whether, the bed wasn't comfortable. They were all great, but the host herself wasn't such a nice person. I think she was just angry at something, one of those people. And I felt, I paid a lot of money to this person. The least they could afford was to be a bit nicer. I'm not saying they should, hug me or do anything to me per se, but they could afford to be a bit more polite, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So because of that, I actually did not enjoy my stay in the city. And I felt that's not nice, a perception that I have of the city because of this one person. So I felt that I wouldn't want anyone to have, such, perception of my own city. So I would host Airbnbs and make sure I'm nicer to these people. So that's how I started. For another reason also, because whenever I stayed in all these locations, especially in the West, all of my hosts were white. And I felt, where are the black hosts? Where are, our people to host our kind, you see? Of course, I'm not looking for a black person to host me, but I thought it would have been nicer, if I met, another, Ghanaian even, or another Nigerian, and then we can have a bit of jollof war and that kind of thing. I thought that could add something to it. But none of my hosts were ever, black, especially in the West. So I thought, well, let's represent our people. So I was going to start, Airbnb. And of course, finally, it could also make me a bit of a bag. If you've been wanting to get into the real estate arena, but you are unsure about how to go about the whole thing, about flipping or flopping properties, about buy to let, about contracts, about person management, about tenants, Airbnb is that safe spot that gives you a foot into the whole game without necessarily risking so much. And yet there's so much lessons that you can learn from it to scale up your whole business. Because on Airbnb, you have control over who books your place. If somebody was to book your place but you are not sure about them, or you Google them or you check them on Facebook and you are not sure about who they are, you can actually decline the booking without accepting it. It also gives you control over when the person comes to your place, because if, for example, you have a weekend that you're not around, you can, block that place so that nobody books. As compared to a buy-to-let or, having a tenant in your place. A tenant stays there, they have maybe a 6-month contract or a 1-year contract. They stay there the whole period. And if you are having friends coming over, sometimes you don't have a place to host them because there's a tenant there. But on Airbnb, you can choose when you receive a guest and when not to receive them. And also, in fact, on Airbnb, you can make lots more money than you would make renting out your house or your flat or your room to a tenant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stay with me till the end of the video and I'll show you how much you can actually make on Airbnb. And before we actually get into all of that, Airbnb is probably the only business, and I hesitate a lot saying this, It's probably the only business that I would recommend to anyone in the diaspora who is thinking of investing in Africa, whether in Accra or Banjul or Dar es Salaam or Zanzibar or even Lagos. If you're thinking of investing back home, Airbnb can be one of those avenues that you can actually look at. If and only if, and I say this with a lot of hesitation, if and only if you can get the numbers right, and if you can get a good person to manage your property for you. Because on Airbnb, one of the ways, diasporans are usually cheated out is that, you rent out your property and today is this story, tomorrow is that story, tomorrow the money has not been paid, yada, 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 yada. Airbnb cuts out all of those noise for you. Recently, I've been mentoring a friend who invests in Airbnb in Accra, and she's super excited about how much she's making out of it. Because on Airbnb, really, you have the app on your phone. You see it when somebody has booked your place. You know it when they are in the place. You can communicate with them on the app. Even if you are in, say, Glasgow or London and they are in Accra, you can speak to them and know how they are getting on. The money is paid directly into your account. It cuts out the middleman for you. Of course, if you're in London and you're managing a property in Accra, then you would need somebody to be there to receive the guests or give them access to the property or even to go clean after them. And that you can arrange with a company. And that is why I say, if and only if you can get the numbers right and you can get a good person to manage the property for you locally. Obviously, if you went to buy a property in my village where there are not so many tourists or where it's not very patronized by visitors, then you may miss out on Airbnb. You may not make as much money. But if you can get the location right and if you can get the numbers right and then find a good person, then you can make some bags. So what kind of property can you actually list on Airbnb? Any property at all can be listed on Airbnb. It could be a spare room in your house or your flat. It could be, an ensuite room in your flat or your house. It could be the whole flat or even the whole house. You can list any of these on Airbnb. Of course, depending on the market you are in or the kind of guest you have in mind. For example, if you have in mind that you'll be receiving a lot of tourists because you live in a city that is very touristy, then how you set up your place will be different from if you live close to, say, a university. And so you'll be receiving lots of students or professors, people who are coming for a short term, because sometimes I've received guests who are, students coming to study for, say, 2 months or 3 months and they need a place to stay, but they can't get into, a long-term contract. They can stay in Airbnb so you can have an arrangement with them. The good thing about Airbnb is that you don't necessarily have to own the place. And I'm sure you know that there are so many people who do this on a full-time basis who don't own any of the flats they actually use or the properties they use for Airbnb. You can speak to a landlord and then, lease their place and also list on Airbnb, of course, with their permission. In fact, one time I went to an Airbnb hosts gathering and I thought I was killing it. I was excited. Then I went to meet this guy who, lists on Airbnb and he make bags. He's a musician, an upcoming musician. And if you know anything about musicians, he's not blown yet, so he's still in the shadows. But he makes lots of his money on Airbnb, and that is enough for him to get by and even sponsor his, music career. And he tells me that he doesn't own any of the properties he lists on Airbnb, and this is how he actually started. He had this 2-bed flat, so he was struggling to pay his rent. So one time he listed the other room on Airbnb. And within a short time, it was booked. And he thought, this thing looks good. So over time, but all this time he was still, low-key. He had not told his landlord yet. So he used the money to, spec up the place. He repainted. He did the bathroom. He specced up the place. And it became very nice. So one time the landlord came in to, inspect the place. And he was super impressed with how he had transformed the place. So he asked that, you're taking good care of my place, So he was, happy with him. So then he told him that, well, I've got something I need to tell you. This is what I've been doing over the last, couple of months. I've been struggling to pay, but then, I listed on Airbnb. I take care of the place. I take care of the guest and, I'll take care of your property. And this guy was like, well, I'm happy for you to do it on the condition that you'll be responsible. Of course, they had a deal and even the tenant offered, to pay a bit even higher than that. So I think he added £200 more because obviously he was making way more than that. And the landlord was happy. Everyone was happy. And that was how he scaled up. Now he would reach out to other landlords who have listed their place, and then he will rent out the place, or he will lease the place for long term, and then he will now list on Airbnb. And that is how he started, scaled up, and now he's got multiple properties that he's making bags from. I've stayed in places where the people I've stayed with did not own the place. It was a flat they were renting, but they had a landlord's permission to list the other room on Airbnb. Because let's face it, what does the landlord need? They need their money, and they need the security that their place is being taken care of. And if you can guarantee these, or if they see that you are responsible, many landlords will not hesitate, especially if you will live in the property. So why don't you think of doing that today? So to the question, how much can you actually make on Airbnb? If you've been listening to me for a while, you know that the answer to most of these questions is that it all depends. And I don't say this as a cliche, but it really depends on where your property is situated and how many bookings you are getting in a month and a few other things. For example, if you live, if your property is in a big city where you get lots of guests and lots of bookings, obviously you make a lot more money than if your property is in a remote village where you don't get lots of bookings. So that is just by comparison. But I guess a relative way to put it is that when I listed my property, I made enough money to cover my mortgage. At the time when I had my property, I was single, had a 3-bed, and so I had 2 spare rooms that I could actually, list. And that made me enough money off it to pay the mortgage and even some to cover bills. If you've not seen my video on how I stayed in the UK without paying rent, I'll put a link to that in the description box below. Do certainly check it out. And at this point, let me actually pause and ask that if you're getting value from this video, can you give me the subscribe button and like this video so that we can reach a lot of people? YouTube tells me that about 70% of the people who watch my channel actually haven't subscribed. Sometimes not out of malice, sometimes you don't even know that you've not subscribed. So let's take a moment so that you can actually subscribe, so that I give you an encouragement to keep doing what I do. Thank you. Now, let's go back. So in relative terms, I made enough money on Airbnb to cover my mortgage, as well as even some to cover my bills. And I hope that gives you some perspective. I used to have a long-term tenant, and for whatever the tenant was paying, I could make double or triple of that even on Airbnb. So that on Airbnb, I knew that I only needed a guest to book for 10 days, and I would make enough money to cover a 1-month rent if I had a long-term tenant. Does that help? So, for example, if the rent in my area was say £500, I needed somebody to stay for 10 days to make that money. So obviously, I have the rest of the days in the month to make profit if I got guests. And I know this may sound all great and all of that, so you are excited and perhaps thinking of doing Airbnb. You need to know your market. While I was fortunate to get lots of bookings, and I'll show you, if you stay with me for a bit, I'll show you how you can increase your bookings. While I had a lot of bookings, sometimes you don't get, lots of bookings like this. So you want to be mindful. If you're thinking of, going to lease a property or get a big mortgage so that you have, 10 rooms and then use 8 for Airbnb, be careful. You want to be sure that at least you can afford the place on your own, or study the market to make sure that you know the minimum to expect to receive a month, so that in a slow month, you can still afford your mortgage or you can afford the rent. You want to be careful so that you don't get yourself into debt because you've become overly ambitious. The beautiful thing about Airbnb is that, and I say this carefully, you can get lucky on Airbnb. Especially if you're in a big city, or your city, or your town, becomes host to a major event. I know a friend who lived in Liverpool, and the Eurovision, I think for last year, was hosted in Liverpool. Oh, man, they made bags on that thing. Because there are people traveling all over Europe needing a place. Hotels were booked, and then they actually, everybody who had a place now listed their place on Airbnb, and the place was getting booked, so they jumped the prices and they made lots of money. Finally, myself and the guys are going out sometime later in the year, and we are booking a place. And guess how much we are paying for it? We are paying about $2,500 for 2 nights to stay in a house. So if we are paying $2,500 for 2 nights, can you imagine if they got other bookings for the rest of the month, how much the person is the host is actually gonna make off Airbnb? So this, story is to give you some perspective of how much you can actually make on Airbnb if you get your numbers right and if you get your location right. So how can you get your numbers right? Do you charge high prices so that, one booking gives you lots of money? Maybe not the wisest choice, but you can check the average price in your area so that you are competitive and maybe even reduce it a bit so that you get more bookings. I guess it's all economics, and I'm not an economist, so you can do as you see pleasing. But the question really is that would you rather want to have more bookings per month so that you make enough money at a reduced price, or you prefer to have a high price and have fewer bookings? It all depends on how you want to, manage it. Of course, you don't have to keep the same price for the whole year or for the whole month. You can charge higher on weekends and you can charge lower on the weekdays. It's all marketing, all, business and how you want to, market your place. Enough of the money talk. Is it all simple or rosy like that? What are the risks? I know you may be asking. Well, the risk, obviously, which I've listed earlier on, is if you are using, your own property, you should be a welcoming person. You should be ready to, host, receive guests, people you don't know, people you may not necessarily like, as much as you may have control, sometimes people come and they surprise you. But to be honest, in all the 2 years that I've been hosting, I've not had, an experience where I'll say, oh, I regret or none of those. Of course, some people will give you great reviews, but some people too, no matter your best efforts, they still give you, some terrible reviews. I remember I hosted this professor from, I'll not name from an African country, actually. He was a professor from an African country. And I thought I was nice to this person, because, I'm a, lecturer and he was a professor. I was kind to him and all of that. And then I read his review and absolute, very sincere. He said there was no coffee shop in the area and you couldn't even have coffee in the house. What are you talking about? I have a French press. I've got a coffee maker. I've got instant coffee. There's a coffee shop right behind, the other side of the street. There's a a cafe down the street there. What are you talking about? Absolute bollocks, but hey, things do happen, but yeah. Of course, I've had, other doctors from, other African countries, and they are absolutely fantastic. So, you get mixed reviews, but if you know that, you've put in your best efforts, the number of, positive reviews you receive will be much higher than the poor ones, so you'll be fine. So, it's not all, easy and all, rosary. Sometimes you receive people that, who can be challenging a bit. But hey, that is your house, my rules. Speaking of rules, when you list your place on Airbnb, you get to decide who comes in, or you get to even set the rules in your house. If you don't want couples, you can state that clearly. If you don't want pets, you can be clear in that. Yeah, your cat may be cute, but hey, not in my house. I remember one person told me, oh, Shadrach, it's only a pigeon. It will be in the cage. I was like, no, mate, not in my house. If you have a pet, I can't accommodate a pet. So you get to decide these rules. And you want to be absolutely clear and uncompromising when it comes to your rules. Because once you start to compromise, guests may take advantage. And, you give them, what do they say? A yard, they will take a mile. So be clear and unambiguous in your rules. You should also use feedback. Whenever I've had guests come over, I would ask them, what did you like about the place? What can I do to improve? And over time, I've used that to improve my place. And my listing, has been, on the top searches most of the time. I'll put a link in the description box below. If you're thinking of listing your place to experiment, to see how it would go, I'll actually put a link in the description box below. If you use that link, Airbnb will pay you £32 to list your place. And yeah, so why not? You can give it a shout. If you're also interested in, listing on Airbnb, but you're not sure how to go about it and you want some mentoring, do let me know in the comment section and I'll reach out to you. Must you list on Airbnb? Of course not. There are other alternatives to Airbnb that you can use. Of course, Airbnb is the biggest platform, so it only makes sense that you are on the biggest platform so that you are easily reachable. But whenever I've said Airbnb, I also mean short-term rentals. You can also list on Verbal or Booking.com or Expedia or even Gumtree. But with Gumtree, you want to be careful. Finally, my experiences on Airbnb. It's been fantastic. I've learned a lot about business, marketing, clients, dealing with clients, I've learned a lot on Airbnb, and I've met some fantastic people also on Airbnb. I've met, network on Airbnb. One final tip I'll give you, that if you're thinking of listing on Airbnb, definitely, in fact, I would encourage you to consider it. But if you do, go to Facebook and search for Airbnb hosts in your area. They are likely to have, a Facebook page. Do join it, and you learn a lot also on the platform about how people are dealing with, various problems or upcoming, changes in the area, how much they are pricing their place. You'll get to meet, people who can show you cleaners, trusted people who can help. I'm aware, this video is already getting long, so I will do another video where I would show you how to deal with clients' problems. How do you deal with taxes and all of that? If that's a video you'd like to see, kindly subscribe to this channel, and I'll do well to record that video for you. If there's any other question you have about this video that I've not spoken about, do let me know in the comment section, and I'll certainly do respond to you. I hope you've been blessed by this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, God bless and adios.